This is lecture 7, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. You'll find this material in chapter 7 of Introduction to Macroeconomics by Paul Middleditch. In today's lecture, we're going to formally introduce the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. This is a model that we were first introduced to in lecture 3. Now we have the full version of this model with a aggregate supply that's split between the short run and long run schedules. We'll also use the model to carry out economic policy analysis, demand management and supply side policy, before going on to look how we can use the model to explain the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis of around 2008. So the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model is a two-dimensional model in prices output space with two agents, one representing the supply side, that's firms, and the other representing the demand side, that's consumers, coming together in a general market where there is an equilibrium. To give an overview of the model, you see the diagram here on the right hand side. In PY space, everything else is assumed constant. We have the assumption of ceteris paribus. There is an aggregate demand curve and two aggregate supply curves, one for the long run and one for the short run. We have a long run general equilibrium where all those curves intersect. Y star, that's the long run rate of output, and at the expected price level in the economy. So in other words, in the absence of price shocks, so long as prices are where they're expected to be, we will be in equilibrium. The aggregate demand curve is the agent that represents the consumer, and the aggregate supply curve is the agent that represents the firm over both time horizons. When they come together, we have a long run general equilibrium. Looking at our first schedule in detail, we start with the aggregate demands curve. Again, remember this is in PY space. Predicts the behavior of the consumer when prices change. How does output demanded change? And that's given by the schedule. With any particular price, P dash, we'll have a level of output demanded which is given by the aggregate demand curve, and here that would be Y dash. Notice that at high prices there is less output demanded, as we would expect, that's intuitive, and as prices fall there is an increase in aggregate demand. When prices change, we move along the aggregate demand curve. Remember that we have made the assumption of ceteris paribus, that the aggregate demand schedule gives us the reaction of the consumer to changes in prices in terms of output demanded. There are other things that affect the consumer than prices and output. We've made this assumption it's constant, so what happens if one of these things changes? Imagine the consumer is suddenly more wealthy because of an increase in the money supply. So something has changed outside the model, so effectively we have a new model. What we see is that the aggregate demand curve will shift. An increase in the money supply will give us an increase in aggregate demand at every price level, or an increase in output demanded at every price level. The aggregate supply curve represents the behavior of the representative firm. Notice that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping as opposed to the aggregate demand curve, reflecting the fact that at higher prices more firms are willing to come into the market, and so higher prices means higher output supplied. In a similar way, if the price level falls, then firms withdraw from the market and supply is reduced. In a similar way to the aggregate demand schedule, imagine that something has affected the representative firm, but there's not a change in either prices or output. And here we have the example of an increase in taxes, an increase in costs for the firm. What we will see is a reduction in supply at every price level. Effectively, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. For the reverse scenario of a decrease in the firm's costs, maybe oil has fallen in price, which is an input for the firm, then we would see a rightward shift of the supply schedule. So if there's a change in P or Y, we have a movement along the schedule. But for anything else that affects the firm, which breaks the assumption of ceteris paribus, there is a shift, or a new model altogether. That's what the shift is. Now that we have introduced the aggregate supply curve, we also have the opportunity to introduce dynamics into the model. And we could do that by splitting the aggregate supply curve into two versions, the short run version and the long run version. We can have a short run aggregate supply curve which will show us the reaction of the economy to economic policy in the short term, and a long run aggregate supply curve that helps us to realize the impact of economic policy after some time has dissipated, so there's sort of a long run effect. And this curve, the long run aggregate supply curve, is simply drawn vertical at the natural or normal rate of output. Now we can show these two curves, the short run and long run aggregate supply curves, on a diagram in PY space. Notice that the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical at Y star, in other words it doesn't change in the short run, output is around its normal rate, and the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping as before. Where these two curves cross is the expected price level. So output will be around its normal rate in the absence of price shocks in the economy. Imagine that aggregate demand has shifted to the right, and that we move along from long run general equilibrium. A shift in aggregate demand might push us along the short run aggregate supply curve, giving us the short run movement of output after this demand shock. What we will see in the long run, though, is the economy return back to its natural rate once price expectations have adjusted to the new higher price level that comes from the increase in aggregate demand. The output can be away from Y star, but only in the short run. In the long run, the expectation of price adjusts so that the economy returns to its natural rate. Now, it is possible that the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve intersect away from Y star. And here we can see a situation where the short run equilibrium given by the intersection between short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is to the left of the equilibrium, long run equilibrium rate of output, Y star. So the short run equilibrium can be away from the long run equilibrium, but only in the short run. From this point, it is possible that the economy can either return back to the long run rate naturally, or it can be pushed back using demand management or economic policy. Just to note, in the short run, we can be away from the long run. However, in the long run, we would always expect short run aggregate supply equal to aggregate demand equal to long run aggregate supply, and the price level to be the expected price level. So we can see that the short run and long run equilibriums are coinciding at this point, and we would expect this over the long term. But how does the economy end up away from its long run equilibrium in the first place to a new short run equilibrium? It might be the economy has been hit from its equilibrium level in the long run by a shock, an economic shock. It could be a shock to the supply side, a shock that hits firms, such as an oil price hike or sudden currency movement, or it could be a demand side shock, something that hits the consumer. It might be a stock market boom or a stock market crash, or even a credit crunch as we saw in 2008. After this shock has hit the economy, we're in a new short run position, and we are definitely away from the long run rate of output. What we can see is that the economy can either return naturally to its long run rate, and that's through the adjustment of prices and aggregate supply, or it can be pushed back to its long run rate using demand management or economic policy. And we see that through a movement in the demand curve. We can now put all of this together in an example, and the example we have here is a negative supply shock. It's a shock, a negative shock to the representative firm. Case study is the oil price rise of 2008. So in 2008, oil has reached $147 a barrel. This has pushed up costs for firms, pushed up the cost of transport, etc., pushed up the price of food. And what we see is the short-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the left to reflect the reduction in supply. Notice we are now in a new short-run equilibrium. Output of Y dash is left of the normal rate. This is below the normal rate. Possibly we are in a recession, as it was, as the case was in 2008. So here we are. From this point, we can now measure or show how the economy will move back naturally to its long run rate or via policy to its long run rate. Option 1 will allow the economy to return to equilibrium, long run equilibrium naturally. So we are in a recession. Y is below Y star. Producers' costs are beginning to fall because there is a recession, and this gradually increases supply until we return to the long run natural equilibrium, where the price level is lower than before, but we're at the natural rate. Option 2 is to push the economy because we do not want to wait too long to return the economy back to its normal rate from a recession, so we're going to use economic policy or demand management. So from this short-run equilibrium, output below its natural rate, we can use expansionary policy to avoid unwanted unemployment. An increase in the money supply or an increase in government spending will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. We push the economy back towards equilibrium using policy. And what is the cost here on the option 1? What's the difference between option 2 and option 1? You'll notice it's the price level. The price level is much higher than under option 1. So the cost of intervention is inflation. We can now use aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to make some economic policy analysis. So we begin with monetary and fiscal policy. Just to revisit what economic policy is, aims to smooth out volatility in the business cycle. We don't want the booms to be as exaggerated or recessions to be exaggerated. The idea is to try to reduce the size of the economy in a boom and to increase the size of the economy in a recession. We can use two types of policy. There is supply side policy, that's channeled through the representative firm, the aggregate supply schedule, and there is demand side policy channeled through aggregate demand, and we see that reflected by shifts in the aggregate demand schedule. Starting with supply side policy, generally seen as long run, expanding the economy through increases in aggregate supply will always give us lower prices. This is good for the economy, but the problem with these policies is they take time to filter in. They're long run policies. Examples are reducing business taxes to increase firms to grow or to attract firms into the UK, economic development funds giving grants to firms to increase economic capacity or infrastructure, or just announcing or employing some contractors to build some new roads or rail lines. That's an infrastructure project. Now we take an example of supply side policy using the ASAD model. We start off in long run equilibrium, where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply is equal to long run aggregate supply, and the price level is at the expected level. There is an announcement that a new high-speed rail connection is going to be built between two important cities such as Manchester and Leeds. This is going to expand the pool of the labour market, the pool of employment, potential employees. Labour costs will be lower, so output will increase. The aggregate supply curve shifts right, and the price level falls in the economy to below the expected price level. What we see is that supply side policy has given us an increase in output and lower prices in the economy in the short run. Look at demand side policy, generally seen as short run, aims to iron out fluctuations in the business cycle through direct intervention. But the problem is with demand side policy is it tends to be inflationary rather than deflationary. It gives us higher prices, so it's seen as a less disciplined way or a less disciplined economic policy. Fiscal policy is changes in government spending or taxation, that's G or T, and monetary policy is using changes in the money supply. We can also show demand side policy. Imagine a scenario after a negative economic shock. The economy is in a short run equilibrium where output is to the left of its natural rate, Y star. I said P dash, Y dash is the new short run equilibrium, but that's away from long run equilibrium. The government or the central bank can increase aggregate demand by using perhaps expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy and push the economy back to its long run rate. Though as we can see, there is an increase in prices as a result. There is an inflationary cost. So we can think of economic policy when it's demand side as a sort of stabilization for the economy. When the economy is down, or it's in a recession, we can stabilize it by increasing output using fiscal or monetary policy. But there is a problem for using demand side policy, and that's presented by the issue of time lags, the difference between when we enact a policy and when the effect on output comes. Demand side policy might involve the time lag of around 6 to 7 months. So the government may increase G. It takes 7 months for that to appear in terms of output. So the timing of the intervention is crucial. In fact, if it's wrong, it's possible that the policy could be destabilizing just as much as it is stabilizing. So we'll see that in diagrams in a moment. Here is an imaginary business cycle, and we can see the components of the cycle, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've got the recession, the economy growing, the economy peaking out in a boom in 3 and then a slowing down again in 4, and the process continues. So imagine that we leave things as they are. There's no policy, there's no intervention. That would be the natural business cycle. Now, we can intervene, and hopefully what we try to achieve is less severe recessions and less severe booms. So we have a smoother profile for output over time, and we can see that there, the successful intervention is going to work well for the economy. Maybe we won't make as much money in the good times, but we'll have less unemployment, less pain in the recessions. The only point, the problem though, is with time lags, is knowing when to stop intervening. Because if we cannot see the end of the recession, then we're going to carry on using policy right up until when the economy turns around. That may be too late. Maybe we should have stopped intervening before we got the economy to turn around, but we wouldn't know when we were there. So what we might do, what we might end up doing, is destabilizing rather than stabilizing the economy, because we're expanding government expenditure, expanding the money supply after we should have stopped, which is about 6 months before the turning point in the economy. The only trouble is we don't know when that turning point is coming, so it can make policy destabilizing. Monetary policy, fiscal policy can be destabilizing. Now we're going to revisit the financial crisis using the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So let's begin with some history of the lead up to the financial crisis. Around 2008, commercial banks across the globe look undercapitalized. In other words, they look at risk of severe default, when it's realized that they hold lots of toxic assets. So the commercial banks react by trying to recapitalize. In other words, they cut back lending sharply in a bid to rebuild their balance sheets. Central banks and governments react worldwide. Central banks start cutting interest rates as the recession appears, and governments start pumping money into commercial banks with the hope of rebuilding the balance sheets to try to calm financial markets. However, because governments are spending so much money recapitalizing commercial banks, they themselves become vulnerable, and the sovereign debt crisis begins. The governments have borrowed so much money, there's now a doubt over their ability to repay the debts themselves. Credit ratings downgrade the credit ratings for these economies, and so they're unable to service their debts. So the only thing left is for central banks to start to print money, and we call that quantitative easing. Lots of money. So let's look at that. Using the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, the financial crisis revisited. We begin our economy in long-run equilibrium. A severe financial crisis has meant that there is a drop in aggregate demand as consumers no longer have credit. The increase in the interest rates has also meant an increase in costs for firms. So both the aggregate demand schedule and the short-run aggregate supply schedule shift to the left. What we have is a very deep recession. We started at the long-run rate of output. The economy has shrunk because of the leftward shift in aggregate demand to Y dash, but again to Y dash dash after the leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Both consumers and firms have been hit by the credit crunch. So starting from this very deep recession with monetary policy already spent, interest rates are already near zero, that hasn't had much effect on the economy, we would expect governments to increase G, to shift aggregate demand to the right. we're still not out of a very deep recession. Going back to the central banks, they already have interest rates at zero, so they have to carry out something called quantitative easing. In other words, essentially it's printing money, buying toxic assets from commercial banks and replacing it with cash. Try and make up for the loan destruction as commercial banks are trying to restructure their balance sheets. So the AD curve does shift to the right, but it doesn't shift anywhere near enough. Fiscal policy is not possible because of the sovereign debt crisis, and central banks have had to resort to quantitative easing. But it's still not enough to get us out of recession. It's going to take quite a while for that, as we've seen from 2010.